Well, hello and welcome everyone. Is this on? Are you hearing me? Okay, great. Thanks for coming to another one of our fabulous lunchtime EC themed lectures. This is the last of the EC related programming for the duration of the exhibition. The exhibition itself will continue to run until July the 10th. So um, if you have friends who you know might be interested in the show and haven't seen it yet, please urge them to come in over the holiday weekend or in the next week because time is running out. The chances to see the show will the last chance to see this is last chance to see basically over the next 10 days or so. So it's a real privilege for me to introduce Mark Arnold, who is a comics and animation historian, author of numerous books. I won't list all of the titles. The one I'm most familiar with is his 2-volume history of Cracked, which is itself, which I have to say gives you some indication of Mark's own sense of humor, that this wonderful 2-volume series features quotations on the back that are all extremely critical of the notion of a history of Cracked magazine. Many of them from people who used to write for Cracked. It's very funny stuff. He's going to talk to us today about that brilliant, misunderstood satirical genius of Harvey Kurtzman. So I'm just going to hand the mic over to him now. Please welcome Mark Arnold.
Thank you. So let's get started. I'll just take a quick poll. So how many here know what Mad is? Okay. I did this for a high school class, and they're like, huh? And how many have read Mad? I guess the same amount. And does anybody here still read Mad? Just curious. Okay. All right. So this is the latest issue, or pretty much the closest latest issue. It's still being published. This is issue 539, and it's one of the recent issues. They did adult coloring books. But today we're going to talk about the man who, depending on who you believe, created or co-created the most famous and successful American humor magazine, Mad, and that's Harvey Kurtzman. And I personally tend to believe co-create because without the input of EC publisher William N. Gaines, that's him, Kurtzman may not have thought up Mad on his own. A little bit about Kurtzman. He was born October 3rd, 1924, and started in comics writing and drawing one-page gag strips under the unlikely name of Hey Look. And I got an example right there. And Kurtzman's Hey Look pages appeared infrequently in various timely comics, the same publishers that would eventually evolve into today's Marvel Comics. And Hey Look had no stars or recurring characters. Its sole purpose was to push a comedic idea to its limits and to make the reader laugh. And so this is a sample page. And Kurtzman had a wild and wacky sense of humor, as you can tell from this example. His personality was such that he could be very serious and somber, though. And he wasn't satisfied with doing these silly one-page gags, although they did pay the bills. And Kurtzman's big aspiration was to be the editor, or at least write for a standard 8.5 by 11-inch magazine, commonly called at the time a slick. And he felt comic books beneath him, but it was just one step at a time. And so when the need for new Hey Look started to dwindle, Kurtzman started looking for other assignments. And eventually, after some random sporadic work, he ended up at the offices of Entertaining Comics, more commonly known as EC. And EC at the time was published by William M. Gaines, which I just showed you. But he took over the business from his father, Max Gaines, who's on the left there. And Max had perished in a boating accident in 1947, and so the elder Gaines was credited in creating the standard pamphlet-style comic book, and that we have today in 1933. And he also founded EC in 1944 as Educational Comics, and published such fare as Picture Stories from the Bible and Tiny Tot Comics. So it's quite the opposite of what EC would eventually be known for. And it was under the EC Educational Comics tag that Kurtzman walked into the office doors in 1949, and he was unaware that William Gaines had been transitioning the comics line to feature books more to his liking. And both Gaines and EC editor Al Feldstein, there they are with a lot of their books, were amused at Kurtzman's error. So what Gaines and Feldstein did see in Kurtzman's portfolio was a strong sense of layout and character design, and they were also amused at Kurtzman's humor pieces. And though they didn't give Kurtzman immediate work, they liked what they saw and Kurtzman liked them. So when they did give him an assignment, one of the first projects that Kurtzman did for EC was educational in nature, and it was a pamphlet about VD entitled Lucky Fights It Through, and there's a sample panel from it. And the success of Kurtzman's work on this pamphlet led Gaines to assign Kurtzman's stories in one of EC's Western titles called Gunfighter in 1950. And then after a few more stories, Kurtzman got the bug again to meet his goals, and he approached Gaines with the idea of editing a title. And so Feldstein edited the entire line, which had gone through various genres such as westerns and romance and crime, and now was settling in on three basic genres: horror, suspense, and science fiction. And so Kurtzman suggested a fourth title, War, and so Gaines let Kurtzman edit his own flagship title, and it was called Two-Fisted Tales. And even though that's issue number 18, that's actually the first issue. And at first, it featured generic war stories. Then as time went on, Kurtzman developed these stories to be both historically accurate and also very anti-war message-based. This was strongly evident when the Korean War broke out, and EC was one of many comic book publishers to publish comic book stories about the current conflict. But no one did them like Kurtzman. And Kurtzman, the anti-war stance that permeated Two-Fisted Tales was the one common denominator that identified all of EC's lines. These were comics that made you think. And then Kurtzman's Two-Fisted Tales turned out to be a success for EC, and soon he was editing a companion title, which was called Frontline Combat, and that's the first issue there. But however, the ever restless Kurtzman once again grew dissatisfied, and he was upset that his income wasn't the same as Al Feldstein's. And when Gaines explained that Feldstein was editing 7 titles compared to Kurtzman's 2, it offered Kurtzman a little comfort. So Gaines suggested that Kurtzman try a third title, which would in turn increase his income by about 50%. He suggested a humor title based on Kurtzman's previous background doing the Hey Look pages. And Gaines felt that Kurtzman could easily dash out a humor book in between the research-heavy Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat books. Boots. So this is the prototype cover for Mad number 1. Kurtzman liked the idea and he agreed, but what to call this new humor book? Kurtzman floated around a few different ideas, as did Gaines. One that they did seem to agree upon was that EC tended to refer to their line of comic books as EC's Little Mad Mags, especially in reference to their horror titles. So this was eventually shortened prior to publication as EC's Mad Mag, and then finally Mad, with the legend tales calculated to drive you mad. Of course, up here it doesn't say it. It's kind of this fictional language up there. But down the spine was, on the prototype here, a funny, funny book. But this too was changed before final publications to the more familiar humor in a jugular vein. And Kurtzman loved little quirky sayings like this. This was material that made him laugh, and eventually it would make everyone else laugh, as terms such as Pochebya, How's Your Mom, Ed, and Melvin entered the vernacular. So this is the first issue of Mad. It bore an October-November 1952 cover date, 36 pages, including covers and ads, and featured 4 separate 7 or 8 page tales that satirized the genres that EC was publishing currently. And on the first editorial page, the issue explains how Mad was to be a different genre from what they had published previously, a comic book. And technically this is true, as EC did publish humorous comics before, but usually the funny animal or the little children variety, or of the standard slapstick type humor. Mad was different, at least for a comic book. This is the first time satire and parody really entered the field, although parodies of superheroes existed almost immediately after Superman debuted with titles like Mighty Mouse and Super Duck, among others. And the first issue had a horror story, which is that one, Hoo Ha, with art by Jack Davis. It also had a crime story, which I'll show you in a minute, a science fiction story, and a war story. And there were no recurring characters, and none of the stories in that first issue were extremely different from what was appearing in other titles at EC. except maybe the artwork. There had been humorous twists in the regular EC stories, especially in the horror titles, so the stories in Mad #1 could have very well been backup stories had Mad never appeared. So the artwork was another matter. Kurtzman himself supplied the cover art and would do so for most of the 23 comic book issues of Mad. And this set the tone for the interiors. They got Jack Davis, who did this art. His sloppy style actually was well suited to humor as much as it was for horror. And then science fiction, Wally Wood's more formal style was relaxed ever so slightly, and he too became a master of humor artistry as much as his science fiction work. John Severin, he did Varmint here, was pretty much John Severin. His stiff, realistic style remained unchanged from the EC War books, and that may have been a contributing reason why Severin was dropped after the first 10 issues of Mad. But the one artist that actually came out of his shell with Mad, and was probably as instrumental to Mad's success as both Kurtzman and Gaines, was Bill Elder. And Elder had done a few horror stories, some war stories with Severin and a few others, but although his artistry was impeccable, there was a certain blandness to it all. With Mad, Elder finally had the palate to expand his internal craziness on the page to the nth degree. And as a result, Kurtzman and Elder developed a friendship and partnership that lasted over 40 years, long after their tenure at Mad. And so Mad #1 sold pretty decently. Those were the first 4 stories. And so did #2 and #3, but not the numbers that Gain was expecting. So, but issue #2 had the germ of an idea, which soon became the defining feature of early Mad, a specific comic parody. In this case, Kurtzman took the iconical Tarzan and renamed him Melvin. And with Severin handling the art, did a remarkable and very funny parody that emulated the classic Bern Hogarth style of the 1940s. And other than this, the rest of #2 and some of #3 continued with the genre parodies. But #3 did parody popular radio shows at the time, even though television already existed, Kurtzman still drew on radio for his inspiration. He did parodies of the Lone Ranger and of Dragnet. And unfortunately, even at this beginning, Mad was on the verge of cancellation. But what happened was the next issue, Mad #4, that set the stage of what was to come with their spot-on parody of Superman called Super Duper Man. And this hit it home because it was the first parody that they did that was a parody of the genre that they were publishing in, the comic book. And not only that, but Kurtzman began to do what he did best, is make an underlying commentary of what was going on behind the scenes. In 1953, DC Comics, who were the publishers of Superman, and Fawcett Comics, who were publishing Captain Marvel, had been battling it out over copyright infringement for years, and Super Duper Man took on this topic as the basis of Kurtzman's story. And even before his sales numbers came in, Kurtzman was off to do his next comic book parody, and the next one was Black and Blue Hawks, as a parody of Black Hawk for issue 5. And one of the remarkable things in this story was for Kurtzman to comment on the character of Chop Chop, here called Chop Chop Chop. And in the original Black Hawk, all the squadron are realistically drawn white men of differing European backgrounds, except for Chop Chop, who was drawn in the stereotypical manner of a Chinese man with a long queue in the back, and he speaks with broken English. But in Kurtzman's version, the caricature is the same way drawn by Wally Wood, but now Chop 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 speaks in elegant Queen's English, saying, "I say, by Jove, what do mine eyes perceive?" So little details like this made reading the old Mad comic books a delight to read over and over. And in the backgrounds of these stories, especially the ones drawn by Bill Elder, they're literally and liberally littered with little signs and characters that were eventually christened as Chicken Fat. And Bill Elder got the nickname Chicken Fat. And Elder was so identified with this trait that by issue #22 of Mad, he was featured an entire book-length tribute to him and introduced just like that as Bill Chicken Fat Elder. And Chicken Fat is just another Jewish reference, as there's many Jewish and Yiddish terms that made their way into the early Mad. Small wonder, as both Kurtzman and Elder, as well as Feldstein and Gaines, in fact, much of the comic book industry were all Jewish. This had a profound effect on the nation as a whole, as much of our humor in the 20th century derived from male New York Jews, be it comic books, animation, film, TV, radio, or stage. And though the effect is now quite distilled because of different ethnicities and women and everybody else in the 21st century, the origins still have the same basic place of origin. So issue number 6 of Mad came out in August, September of 1953, and it had another first. This time Kurtzman parodied a movie, and this set the stage for what Mad still does to this day, which is movie and TV parodies. In this case, they did parody of the 1933 King Kong and rechristened it Ping Pong. And the movie was ripe for parody as it had been reissued many, many times to the theaters. And it was also a favorite of William M. Gaines, so Kurtzman knew he would have a fan. And it became easier to parody movies as opposed to comic books, radio shows, or TV shows, as a movie was a set piece within itself, with each and every individual scene open to ribbing or ridiculing. This is especially easy if something from the source material was either lame or didn't make sense. Like at the bottom there, they're actually talking about cutting through the fog that's thick as pea soup, and they literally cut through it with a knife there. So. Also, first for this issue, Mad parodied poetry, and with Kurtzman's take on Casey at the Bat. And this one's drawn by Jack Davis. And these Mad poems were rarely rewritten. Rather, the poem remained the same, while the various Mad artists took visual liberties with what the poetry meant for comedic effect. And this is not to say that Kurtzman was out of the picture on these, not having to write the words. Actually, the opposite was true, as Kurtzman would meticulously lay out every panel of every story of every issue of Mad. And the artists were expected to remain faithful to his layouts. This could be frustrating for some artists who would rather have the freedom to create their own layouts, but Kurtzman's excellence as a layout man made the point rather moot. And one of the reasons Kurtzman turned to poetry is that Mad really was a material suck. And even though it was a bi-monthly, the perfectionist Kurtzman devoted more and more time to Mad. And what was supposed to be a quickie humor magazine, dashed off quickly to supplement Kurtzman's income, turned out to be more and more challenging than even the research done for the war books, because in this case, Kurtzman had to be funny. Not only funny, but he wanted to be intellectually funny, and that took some effort. At this time, everything was fair game for Mad, and in number 7, Mad parodied books and other movies. In number 7, they had Sherlock Holmes, which was called Sherlock Holmes, and they also did Treasure Island. And Treasure Island, there's no parody title, but sometimes Kurtzman deliberately chose not to parody a title for fear of that he might be losing the reader and what the source material was. Also in number 7 was the first evidence that Kurtzman was running short of material, and 6 pages were taken up with old "Hey Look" gags. There's another example. This is again done in issue 8, and it was noticeable to regular readers that something was up since Mad was resorting to reprints. Turns out that Kurtzman was also suffering from yellow jaundice brought on by the stresses of turning out 3 books at regular intervals. So something had to be done, and it was done soon. Frontline Combat was canceled after the 15th issue, and the editing chores for Two-Fisted Tales was turned over to John Severin, and then Mad was turned into a monthly with its 9th issue. And by this time, Mad was clearly a breadwinner for EC, and Gaines wanted to lighten Kurtzman's load somewhat, and also have him focus on what was making EC money, which at this point, near the end of the Korean War, was not the war books. So for EC in 1954, their horror books like Tales from the Crypt and Shock and crime suspense stories were the biggest money makers. The science fiction titles never did very well, but they were kept on the roster as Gaines liked them so much, and Feldstein was able to handle the workload. And one more comment about issue 8. This one, they had a parody of Batman called Batboy and Reuben. And it would be another funny parody as usual, but the most interesting part of the parody contained the disclaimer that you see right there in the first frame. Notice, this story is a lampoon. If you want to spend your dime on cheap, rotten lampoons instead of the ever-loving, genuine, real thing, go right ahead, boy. So apparently the Super Duper Man parody didn't sit very well with the people at DC, but since parody and satire is protected by free speech, they really couldn't do too much about it, so that's why Kurtzman put that disclaimer. And issue 9 and 10 had more of the same, but like I said, Man was now a monthly. But then issue 11 holds a major significance. Up until now, Mad had a pretty set format, especially on the covers. And with this issue, Mad really starting to live up to its title, especially when they secured the services of Mad's wackiest artist, Basil Wolverton. And Basil's Life magazine cover, which you've probably seen, is one of the most iconic images when one thinks of the early Mad. And it was this image that was used to promote this very EC show. So number 11 is also significant in another way, as previously Mad had only made fun of various forms of media. With this issue, there was Mad Reader, and it actually poked fun at its paying audience. And this was a risky gamble, as readers could be offended by the strange Wolverton drawings intending to represent a typical Mad Reader, but regular readers ate it up, and it was just another one of Mad's early successes. And Mad poked fun at Mad had competition by this point from other publishers because obviously due to their success, and so Mad poked fun at that by doing the first of many "Beware of Imitations" advertisements. And then, interesting at the time, EC started its own Mad imitation called Panic, but this was published or edited by Al Feldstein, and it was issued much to the chagrin of Kurtzman, because he was using the same artists who worked on Mad. We go through issue number 12. They poke fun at Archie with Starchy. And from number 13 on, Mad was hitting its stride, and nothing was off limits. They parodied books, they parodied movies, newspapers. And but number 14 was the first one to actually poke fun at a TV show. But strangely enough, it was a show nobody's even remembered. It was a show called The Continental. And it's an obscure TV show, even back then, featuring a man who dressed in an after-dinner jacket, also called a smoking jacket, and he addressed the women in the audience watching the show. My dad actually remembers this show. The show was parodied successfully on Saturday Night Live in more recent years by Christopher Walken, but the original is now largely forgotten. And one of the things they did also in their early TV parodies is put prominent scan lines to show you that indeed you're watching something on television, and they did that in a number of parodies later on too. But anyway, it's interesting things about Mad in general. It's a time capsule of what was going on at the time, and it's a fun way to learn history, as it made me want to investigate further when I would read about some of these obscure parody topics like Continental. And issue number 15 and number 18 also showed Kurtzman running out of material again, and this time Mad resorted to Kurtzman's Potshot Pete. That's just an example. It was stories he did in the past. And then he did, in issue 16, a salacious stab at newspapers, making the overall comment that newspapers were just as bad or worse than comic books for readers. But by this point in 1954, comic books were under fire as the cause for juvenile delinquency, which you probably heard in other talks here. And Mad was somewhat immune to this controversy, at least for now, and continued to poke fun at everyone and everything. Mad's 17th issue continued to innovate, and with the cover that was the insides were upside down, but also was more hard-hitting on current events by satirizing the McCarthy hearings with What's My Shine, a parody of What's My Line, and then this one is also displayed upstairs, Bringing Back Father, a parody of Bringing Up Father, by showing more realistic portrayal of what it's like to be hit by a stack of plates or a rolling pin, courtesy of guest EC artist Bernie Krigstein. And then number 18 has another classic and one of my favorite EC parodies of all times, which is also upstairs. How'd he do it? And this is a parody of the long-running TV show. And it was one of my favorites due to the excellent artwork by Bill Elder and for the fine script by Harvey Kurtzman. And to this day, I still quote lines from this story like, "Hey kids, what time is it?" Followed by the kids' answers, which are hilarious. I don't know what time it is. Is it nap time? Bath time? Time magazine? I don't know. I don't have a watch, mister. Also great are the scenes where Howdy Do It is a shill for products such as Bup Goo, Squishy's Bread, and Fudd, the breakfast of chimpanzees. So this is great stuff, especially when you're 8 years old. That's when I first saw it. So, and my first exposure to this material was actually in the 1970s because Mad would reprint them in paperbacks and even in the super specials, they would have a Mad insert called Nostalgic Mad. And even though Howdy Doody was a distant memory by that point, I still found humor in these timeless type stories. And like I said, that's a great thing about Mad. First, from this story, you can learn what was popular in 1954. And if you experienced it firsthand, you can enjoy this elegantly warped twist on your fond memories. And let's see, issue number 19 looked like a racing form on the cover and had a parody of Mickey Mouse called Mickey Rodent. And number 20 had a cover like an old composition book telling kids to sneak it into the class. And number 21 had a parody of Popeye called Poopeye. And this one had a parody cover of those little novelty ads that used to be advertised. That's upstairs too, if you want to see that cover. Issue number 22, the cover's upstairs as well. It's the All Elder issue. And then issue number 23, the final comic book issue, had a simple think on the cover, which seems to be the overriding theme of all EC comics, that they're comics that make you think. And these last 4 or 5 issues are some of the best of the early Mad, and I could go on for another couple hours with the good contents of them, but every issue of the first 20 issues, the 23 issues of Mad are worthy of investigation. So after 3 years and 23 issues of Mad, Harvey Kurtzman was getting antsy, and his comic book Mad was the most successful in the industry, but he was unsatisfied even then, and he felt that the big money and prestige was in editing a magazine and not in comic books. And he received an offer from a magazine called Pageant. And he went back to William M. Gaines, asking him to transform Mad into a magazine, and complete with longer text pieces and features, or he would leave for Pageant. And Gaines didn't want to lose one of his star employees, so he crunched the numbers, and he agreed to allow Kurtzman to make the change in format to keep him on board. And the first issue, which was issue 24, looked like that. And contrary to popular belief, Mad was not transformed into a magazine to avoid the New Comics Code seal, but rather it just turned out to be a happy coincidence and a blessing in disguise, because if Mad stayed a comic book, it probably would have been extremely scrutinized, watered down, and censored, and probably would have gone the way of Panic, which was canceled after 12 issues in 1956. So issue 24 here was an instant success. It actually went in for a second printing, which is basically unheard of in the magazine industry. And Kurtzman continued to edit the magazine through issue number 28 in 1956. But again, he had higher aspirations if he was to continue. And at this point, Kurtzman went to Gaines and he demanded 51% of EC. And Gaines told him to take a hike. So Gaines brought back Feldstein as Kurtzman's replacement, and Feldstein helped make Mad the success that continues to this day. And Feldstein retired in 1984, and John Ficarra is the current editor. He's been ever since. So what happened to Kurtzman? Kurtzman went on to varying degrees of success after leaving Mad in 1956. The first one was no relation to the presidential candidate, Trump. And this was published for 2 issues for Hugh Hefner at Playboy, but Hugh pulled the plug because it was a very costly magazine and he was having a few money issues, and so only 2 issues appeared. Then in 1958, Kurtzman pooled his money with the other artists and self-financed this comic called Humbug. It ended up lasting 12 issues, but since most of the people financing it were artists and creators and not business people, it didn't make any money. And Kurtzman's really last major magazine to try, he did Help from 1960 to 1965. And this launched the careers of people like Gilbert Shelton and Robert Crumb, who did a lot of underground comics. There's a lot of fumettis, a lot of photos, captions just like these, with celebrities just like Sid Caesar there. And but after 1965, pretty much Kurtzman decided not to do any more magazines, and his main bread and butter that he did was with Will Elder, and they went and did years and years of Little Annie Fanny for Playboy. And this is like a sexualized parody of Little Orphan Annie, and it ran in Playboy off and on from 1962 to 1988. And As always, Bill Elder was there to provide the artwork, and they made. And then after they stopped doing this, and and Feldstein retired from Mad, Kurtzman and Elder made a final run with Mad from 1985 to 1988. And Kurtzman did a few more projects after 1988, but his health was starting to decline, and he died on February 21st, 1993. And if you want to hear more information or read more information, Bill Shelley wrote this excellent book called Harvey Kurtzman, the Man Who Created Mad and Revolutionized Humor in America. And you get a feeling, at least I did after reading this, that Kurtzman suffered his entire life of unfulfilled ambitions. To the average person, being the creator of Mad alone would probably seem like a tremendous pedigree, but Kurtzman always seemed to be wanting more and somehow succeeded in attaining less every time he tried. But what is true that virtually everything Kurtzman touched his hand on had some sort of merit, and he was instrumental in launching the careers of many, many other cartoonists and writers, and of a magazine that has become a cultural institution, Mad. Because without Mad, you wouldn't have Saturday Night Live or The Daily Show or South Park or Family Guy or any of the late night shows or the comedic clips you can see on YouTube, like on 9gag.com or collegehumor.com or crack.com or theonion.com, or even most of the stuff now, the humor stuff you see on social media. In most cases, Mad was first. And there's the latest issue now. Any questions? Yes. Okay. Most of those things, well, the character, Kurtzman found an old drawing of Alfred E. Newman. It didn't have a name. It was just a character of this grinning guy with a missing tooth. And if Kurtzman gave it a name, it was Melvin Kosnowski. And it was just like a character he would put just in random spots. It even appears on the cover of issue 21, the comic book, as a rubber mask. And on the cover of the first Mad paperback, The Mad Reader. But it was Al Feldstein who actually got an artist named Norman Mingo to draw the definitive Alfred E. Newman and actually gave him his name. That this isn't Norman Mingo's artwork, it's Mark Fredrickson, I believe. But he still draws in the same Mingo style, and that's become the Mad trademark. But the character itself, origins go back to the 19th century. It was like originally a painless dentist ad, where a kid was pointing to the missing tooth saying, "It didn't hurt a bit." So that's the basic origin. But in reality, it's actually a public domain character, but Mad still, lays claim to it. It's kind of interesting that way. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That it started with 18? No. It had more to do with that's the way EC did a lot of things. If you really study your EC, a lot of the titles never started at number 1 because they were something else. I don't know the chronology, but one of them started as Happy Hula Hands or something, and then eventually by issue 12 was like Weird Science. I could be wrong on that one, but yeah. Yeah, that was just a happy coincidence. Yeah, I forgot what Two Fisted Tales was before. I mean, if you know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there was subscription. A lot of people bought comics in this period by subscription, and I'll confirm this if I get the details right. But basically, the post office charged a fee to publishers for any printed material that they sent through mail. You needed a license for each individual magazine. So the cheap publishers, Gaines saw a way of saving money, and not having to pay for a new license for every new title. If you just tried to fool the post office into believing that it was the same title, because you kept the numbering continuing. And they caught him out several times.
Yeah, eventually he had to stop it. So that's why Panic starts at number 1, let's say. He didn't do that. But
have two separate issues of particular numbers. I think it's the Haunt of Fear that begins with number 17 and then it ran long enough that it came back round?
Yeah.
17.
Weird science is that. Yeah, so there's like two number 17.
Yeah.
Except they're published like 4 years apart. So
Publishing trying to avoid paying money.
Also, they had
in early comic books, they used to have a text piece, and that was related to that too. So issues of Mad in the early days always had a text page, and the horror books did too, and everything else. Yes.
Well, the way that the arc of the story, you sort of said in the Kurtzman's story, I mean, because you suggested at the end, and it's a feeling that I got reading Shelley's book too, that there's something self-defeating about his personality in some ways. That he works sort of obsessively and has this extraordinary kind of zeitgeist moment with Mad, which then, I mean, for example, when he asks Gaines, "I'll stay if you give me 51% of your company," right? Could he possibly have imagined that Gaines would say yes to that? I mean, or is it one of those, I'm going to leave and I'm going to ask for something so ridiculous that there's no way that you could say yes? It's such a strange...
Yeah, it is, but it has the precedent
Of, he had, had the pageant offer like a year or 2 or 3 years before. And so maybe he said, well, this time if I stay, maybe if I ask something ridiculous, I don't know. Yeah, I was like, yeah.
Better income.
I don't know if he's ever talked about it, because there are interviews with
Kurtzman, but I've never seen anything about that. I've only heard or read Gaines' side on it, and it's like, I'm not giving up my company.
And something that anyone would have said yes to.
Yeah. I agree with you. It's like, why didn't he ask for
like 10% or 20 maybe? Because I don't think he had any ownership claim. He was just paid by being an editor.
If he wanted to jump ship and it was a way of making it, because he had the offer from Hefner.
Yeah.
And it was a way of making, essentially turning his back on Gaines, who had supported him for the previous 5 years, and being able to say, well...
Yeah, I've never found out conclusively either way, but I mean, it makes sense, what you're saying.
The other thing is about that later, Little Annie Fanny, and another kind of elephant sort of thing. I mean, Robert Crumb says somewhere, I think, that he thinks of Kurtzman as, he learned from Kurtzman and Elder everything that he needed to know about drawing. The early Mad was tremendously important to him,
Right.
and then he considered Kurtzman's sort of this late work as a real downfall compared to the sort of the great heights of the early 50s.
Right.
And blamed Hefner for it, basically. Blamed Hefner for kind of ruining Harvey Kurtzman. Do you have any thoughts about that?
It sounds pretty true. I mean, I don't know if Kurtzman gave up because the money was good for this.
Yeah.
Because obviously they had the time and patience to make it fully painted, which is something you don't do in
Regular comic books. And it didn't appear every issue. It was just like, every so often. So, but for a while there, he was doing this and help at the same time. So it kind of made sense. But then, I don't know, maybe he just gave up and just said, help with it. I don't know. It's like
This?
How long does he do? Yeah, it's over.
It's from 62 to 88.
So it's like, so 25 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge chunk of a creative life.
Yeah.
Um,
I think he really adored Hugh Hefner.
I think he really did. But maybe he kept doing this on the off chance that Hefner might give him another chance with another magazine, maybe not Trump, but something else, and it never really materialized because Hefner was pretty much Playboy. But he did get to publish this book of reprints. I don't know, but
yeah. So rereading the material, it's very easy to celebrate EC from the point of view of the progressive attitudes towards things like race and the satirical instincts, the anti-McCarthyism of something like Lost Men Shine, these are really important and at the time culturally brave pieces. Around issues of gender, they often seem much more of their era. And I'm thinking now in particular place. So you did mention the Wonder Woman parody, but of the 3 big superhero parodies.
Oh yeah.
There's
I was just
Superman,
cut for
and
time,
then
but yeah.
then they get around to doing a Wonder Woman parody. And I've never been able to tell, at the end of it involves her being sent back into the kitchen.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
I honestly don't know how to read it as in terms of its satirical intent. I mean,
Yeah.
is that another? You know, is it fair to say these guys were a lot sharper on some of these issues and gender as a blind spot, or are there moments in looking at that I'm missing?
It might be because
I mean, you know, and I'll just say the comic book industry as a whole. It's like you read like the romance comics of any publisher, and 99% of them, I think, were written by men, and men that had dysfunctional home lives or unhappy marriages or something, and so they reflected what they saw or whatever, and you know, but whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. You know, it's like I just think it was the tenor of the times, I guess. You know, I don't really have an explanation for it. It does stand out now as being possibly more shocking, but you know. That's it. Hi.
okay.
That's a repeat me because I have a disabled voice.
I'll repeat if you
Okay.
can understand.
Yes, please. I'm sorry.
It's Thursday.
Yeah, it's usually on Thursday.
Okay.
I'm a vocal cord.
Okay.
Very good exhibit.
Very good exhibit.
Thanks.
Yeah, we will be there again tonight to see it.
Mhm.
They'll be here again tonight to see it.
Several of us will be there.
Several of them.
We are with the psychiatric survivors movement,
We're with the Psychiatric Survivors Movement.
Mad Pride,
Mad Pride.
Mad in America.
Mad in America.
People interested, I would suggest Googling
Anybody interested, I suggest Googling
Okay.
Mad in America
Mad in America.
or Mind of Freedom.
Or Mind Freedom.
I directed Mind of Freedom for 25 years.
He was the director for 25 years of Mind Freedom.
My question is twofold. One,
Okay, his question is twofold. The
Okay.
first thing,
you see any connection with that movement that my friend can
do you see any connection to the movement in which Ken Kesey out?
our movement, which my friend can
You mean for Mad Magazine?
No,
Oh.
yes, let me rephrase, sorry, it's difficult. Is you see any connection between mad, weird comic industry and that psychiatric movement helped by Ken Kesey?
I don't know if Ken Kesey ever read Mad, but
I'd like to think he probably did. I mean, if Crumb was influenced, it's a sure bet that anybody from that generation, you know. Okay.
Inspiration. Have you ever heard of Satanism?
Have you ever heard of Satanism?
not sure, no.
Love it, I love it. For me, years is so fun. Mesquite, so we worked 42 years.
I think everybody heard you. You worked for 42 years, and it's so funny.
Against Satanism.
Against Satanism.
No one has heard of it.
And nobody's heard of it.
Is that not funny?
I saw a person in the back row with his hand up. Did you have a question?
Oh, mine's more of a sort of a technical question about Kurtzman's layout style.
Okay.
So it's a bit of a different direction, but
That's fine.
I was just wondering what
Well, that's good.
that his layout style was unique and sort of celebrated by the other editors. It seems like that was what they really liked about him, in addition to his artistic style and his humor.
Right.
I'm wondering, did his layout style remain in Mad after he left? Did it set a sort of precedent for Mad Magazine? Is it around today, or was it just something that lived and died with him as layout editor?
Because, Feldstein always allowed the artists pretty much creative freedom. So I'm sure there was a little of that influence, especially in the early years as time went on. Current Mad, it's hard to say because there's such a diverse cross-section of artists, but if you go back to just like the TV and movie parodies, Tom Richmond's the guy who does them typically now. It used to be Mort Drucker and Angelo Therese. I think Richmond, since I've spoken to him before, and he's a big fan of Mad, tries to emulate what has been done before, be it Drucker or be it Kurtzman's layouts. But, whether they're directly doing it, I don't know. But I mean, I think they do continue on this format, which other comics books did too. This is just a sample, with a big, giant opening frame. They still do that now. Like, I think the latest issue has Batman versus Superman parody, and it starts out on the double-page spread of all the superheroes, and then they have balloons at the top commenting about things. Very similar to that, so, yeah. Yeah.
In that style. Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a couple of questions. I was wondering, was there a friendship between Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman, and if so, is there anything you can tell us about that? Or?
I believe there was, because they both at one point worked for Kitchen Sink. I don't know how detailed that was, whether they were just friendly with each other. I can't think of an instance where they actually worked together. I could be wrong on that one. But it wouldn't have been in Mad. I know that because I don't think Eisner ever did anything in Mad. Eisner did do stuff for Crazy Magazine, which was Marvel production. But
comics was as an assistant to Eisner. So they would have known each other.
yeah,
But and they both had, I think at the time, maybe a similar. I don't know. Eisner's such a businessman.
yeah. I bet Eisner was approached over the years to work for Mad or any EC publication, and probably, money considerations and the independence that Eisner had with his own studio probably prevented him from doing that, because I've heard that in relation to The Spirit before, that if he does, at least early on, if he didn't have control of it, it was like, I don't want to do it.
When you start getting into the early 1980s or so with Pacific Comics and Eclipse and whatnot, independent publishing, do you know if Kurtzman was ever approached or given any sort of, carte blanche deal like Jack Kirby and Dick Cohen before? Or?
He made a few appearances in different magazines. He was in Tales of the Bijou, I know that, which was kind of a homage to Mad also. He appeared in various undergrounds, but I can't remember now. I do know this, that shortly before his death, he did 2 issues of Two-Fisted Tales for Dark Horse. Yeah, and that was like the last things he did. And actually, now that I think about it, you asked about Eisner. Eisner did the cover on one of the 2 issues. So I think, I can't think of the artist's name who did the other one, but yeah, Eisner did the cover on one of them. So that was the one instance I can think of, where they did work together. Anybody else? Thank you.